What's up, everybody? Welcome to Coding with Chaim. In this week's video, we're going to talk about locking down a Node API using JSON Web Tokens. So I think the best way to understand what a JSON Web Token is to kind of see it in action. So in order to demonstrate it, what I've done is I've created a simple sample app where there's basically a table of users that's represented here in this JSON file, and then I've also got a table of cars that's represented in this JSON file. And so as you can see here, each user has an ID on them. So like John has an ID of 1, Jane has an ID of 2, and then in this table of cars, each car has a user ID that corresponds back to one of those users. So like this Honda has a user ID of 1 to represent that it belongs to John, and then say this Lexus has a user ID of 2 that represents that it belongs to Jane, as you can see here. And so the idea basically is I kind of want to make this data only accessible to those who are currently logged in. In other words, if you don't have a token, if you're not logged into the system, you cannot see the data. Furthermore, I also want to make it so that once you actually log in and you have a token and then you try to make a request, you only get to see the data that actually belongs to you. So for instance, John can only see his cars and Jane will only be able to see her cars. Let me actually demonstrate that right over here. So I've actually got my server, my sample server running. As you can see, this one is running on 5,000. And so this is the request that I have open here in the tab on Postman. So basically, we're going to go to localhost 5000, make a GET request to the data endpoint, and let's see what happens. If I hit send right now, I'm going to get an error saying that there's no token, right? I'm basically logged out. I don't have a token, so therefore I can't actually see the data. So what we're going to do is we're going to head on over to the login request. And if we go to the login request, we can see that the body is sending in a username as John, password is just password. And if I go ahead and hit send, I get a token in return, right? So now this is the actual token that's in question. This right here is a JSON Web Token. So this is what this entire video is all about. And this is what we are now going to be able to use to sort of identify ourselves for all subsequent requests that A, we are logged in, and B, who we are. So what I can now do is I can go ahead and grab this token, come back to the first request, and we come on over here to the request headers, right? And so over here, you can already see that I've got this header that's called x-axis token, and its value is currently set to an O token. I'll pass the new token on in, go ahead and hit send, and now we actually get data back. And as you can see, the data here is where I'm getting like an array of objects, right? And I've got a make of a Honda, and then it's got my user ID of 1, a Nissan, and a Ford, right? And now interestingly, if I come over here and if I change this to be Jane, which is another user that I have, and I change the password to be password1, and now I log in, I'll now get a new token. And if I go ahead and grab this token and then I try to get the data, I'm going to get an entirely different data set. So check this out. Take the token, come back here, pop it into the value for the x-axis token header, go ahead and hit send, and now I'm getting different data. I'm getting Lexus, BMW, and Mercedes, and as you can see, the user ID is 2. So what we've just seen is the fact that when we don't have a token, we are not able to see the data, which means we've effectively locked down our Node API. In order to get that token, we have to log in. And once we log in, the token will somehow be able to identify who we are, right? And that's kind of the whole scope of this video. That's exactly what I want to talk about. So exactly this sample app that I've just shown you, we're going to actually walk through it step by step and kind of build our own. So let's get into that. So as always, if you want to follow along, you can find all the necessary boilerplate, all the starter files down in the description box below. There will be a link to a ready-made code sandbox, as well as a link to the actual GitHub repository if you want to just clone or download that. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is actually install JSON Web Token, which is a library that we're actually going to use to handle the JSON Web Tokens in our application. So we're going to go ahead and say yarn add JSON Web Token. Okay, so now that that's installed, we can start writing some code. So let's import our data. So we're going to go ahead and grab the users. Const users is equal to require /users.json. And then let's also go ahead and get the cars. Whoops. Const cars is equal to require /cars.json. Okay, so now we have our data imported. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually create an endpoint where users can log in. So this is what this is going to look like. So we're going to make a post request. We're going to say app.post to /login. And then we're going to go ahead and say res. Okay, great. So basically, in order to log in, you have to basically send in your username and password, as we've just seen in Postman, right? So in other words, if we come back here, we're going to look at this. This is kind of what we're trying to recreate. We're going to basically create an endpoint. The users are going to have to send in their username and password. And if they both match, in return, you'll get a token, right? So let's actually make that happen. The first thing we need to do is we actually have our users table right over here. So we can basically say const user is equal to users.find, because it's an array, right? It's an array of objects. So find me this particular user where the username matches. So we're going to say user, where user dot user.username is equal to rec.body.username. Okay, so this assumes that we are actually going to find a user that actually has this username in our table, right? So if we do, we're going to handle that. So we're going to say if user. We're going to handle that by basically checking to see that the password matches. If we don't find a user like that, that means that this user doesn't even exist in our system. Then clearly you cannot be authenticated here because you don't even have an account with us. Then I'm very simply going to say res.status. I'm going to send you back a 401.json with the message of access denied. So that assumes that we didn't actually find a user. Now let's say we do find a user. So if user, now let's go ahead and see if the password matches. So we're going to say if user.password is equal to rec.body.password. Fix that. So if you are in fact if your password actually matches, it means you do exist in our system, your password actually matches. Well, now we know that you are who you say you are, and we can actually go ahead and give you a token. But before we do that, let's first handle the case where the password doesn't match. And once again, we're pretty much just going to do exactly this. We're just going to go ahead and say that you're going to get a 401 and your access is denied. Now, what happens if the password matches? Well, now is where we start to actually create the token. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to bring in the JSON Web Token library that we just installed. Const JWT is equal to require JSON Web Token. And now we can start using this. So we're going to say const token is equal to JWT.sign. Now this is the actual sign method. This is kind of how we actually create the token. And the sign method really accepts 3 arguments. So we're going to be using all 3. So the first one is actually kind of like the payload of what you want to sign into the token. And so what do I mean by that? Well, as you've seen earlier, when I was demonstrating the old app, in other words, the sample app that I have working, when I actually send my token into a request, I actually get the data that belongs to me based on who I was signed in. So for instance, when I signed in as John, I got only the cars that belong to John, and each car had a user ID of 1 to indicate that that's a car that belongs to John. But then as I signed in as Jane, I got all of Jane's cards, right? And I of course, in this request, didn't identify myself as John or Jane. All I did was actually send in the token. So clearly the token had some information about who I am as a user. And so that's that first argument of what JWT.sign actually accepts. And it can pretty much accept anything, really. In other words, any kind of data that you kind of want to sign into the JWT, you can do anything you want. But what's very common to do is to kind of sign in some information that can uniquely identify the user so that in all subsequent requests, you can get the data that matches to this particular user based on their permissions or based on what actually belongs to them, and so on and so forth. So we're going to say that the user ID is equal to the user.id. That's the first argument that kind of gets passed into JWT.sign. The second thing that gets passed in is known as a secret. I think the best way to kind of describe the secret is to think of the token as a door and the secret as a key, right? So the way that this JSON Web Token library works is that if you want to unlock this particular door, being the token, you must have this particular key, being the secret. So the very same secret that was used to kind of lock the token or to sign the token is the very same secret that must get used in order to unlock it. So if somebody was to try to send in a token from some other server, in other words, someone was trying to get clever with our particular system, and they were trying to hack us, I guess, and trying to send in a token that looked a lot like our tokens, but because it wasn't signed by the same secret, JSON Web Token actually won't give you access. It'll just say that you have an invalid token, and then we're going to just go ahead and send the 401. And we can actually see that in action in a little bit. But that's kind of the important thing to know about the secret, is it's effectively the key that's kind of used to unlock this particular door. So every door has one corresponding key, and they have to match, right? So, and this can be any arbitrary string. Of course, you want to try to keep it something that is not really guessable. So typically you'd use something that's like very, very arbitrary, and you'd kind of hide it away in some kind of like environment variable file like a .env, because you really don't want this to be seen. Because again, if you have this, then I can sign any token that I want, and then I can send it into you, and then therefore your security would kind of go bye-bye, because again, this is effectively the key to your door, right? And then finally, the last thing that we're going to send in is basically some options about the token. And so what's necessary to us is we're really just going to do the expires in, just to tell it that, you know, this token will only be valid for X amount of time. So we're just going to do 30 minutes. It won't really be relevant, but if, you know, if in your app, if you have like some kind of requirements where you have to have like a specific amount of time that the token can be valid for based on compliance, this is where you're going to actually go ahead and set that. Now that we actually have the token, we can go ahead and say res.status of 200, .json, and then we're going to go ahead and send the token. Okay, great. So now that we actually have that done, now it's actually time to start doing something with this token, right? Let's come over here and let's actually build an endpoint where a user can actually try to get their data once they're logged in, right? So let's do that. So we're going to go ahead and say app.get. So we're going to say /data. Now we're going to go ahead and say res. And so this is where something known as Express middleware kind of comes into play. So very briefly, in case you're not already familiar with Express middleware, I'm just going to take a 2-minute diversion to explain that, because in order to understand how we're going to be using our function to actually check for the token on every request, we kind of have to understand middleware, because we're literally going to be writing a middleware function to do just that, to actually check the token for every request. So basically what happens is every single endpoint that you create with Express, in other words, here we're creating an endpoint with the route of /data, accepts functions as arguments, right? So in other words, the first argument is always going to be the actual URL, sort of like which path will this particular method get called on, and then you can kind of pass in functions, and you can actually pass in more than just one function. So right now we're just passing in just the one, which really would just accept a rec and a res, and that's going to be our method handler, where we're actually going to go ahead and do whatever we want to do, whatever kind of processing we want, and then kind of send back the data, right? But as it turns out, you can actually send in more than one function here, and this is known as the sort of middleware chain. So for instance, if I come here, like a pretty common use case for this middleware is to sort of do a logger, right? So let's say I create a logging function, that I kind of want to log something every single time I get a request, right? I may want to log, what kind of information was sent to me, or what time the request happened, what I sent back, whatever. You can think of any different type of thing that you might want to do whenever you're logging things. And so loggers typically work as middleware because they happen on every single request. So what we'll do is, for this particular function, since it's a middleware function, it accepts the same arguments, rec, and res, but it also accepts something called next. And the truth of the matter is this method handler here also accepts next, but because we don't need it, we're not even going to bother defining it. But middleware functions do need next. And I'll explain in a second why they need that. So right now, all I'm going to do is just simply say console.log. And then we're just going to log hello every single time we get a request. Now, I'm going to purposely leave out the next. I'm not actually going to do anything with the next because I want to demonstrate the importance of the next. So now what we'll do is we'll come right over here and we'll pop the logger in. So basically, the way that this reads now is when a request comes into /data, first call the logger function, then call this function, which is going to be our own individual method handler. So now, very simply, if I just go ahead and do res.status of 200, right? Of course, I'm just going to be sending back dummy data for now, just to kind of demonstrate the point of middleware. So we're just going to go ahead and say hello, right? So let's actually run this code really quickly, and let's see what all of this adds up to. So we're running that on 1337. Let's just come over here and make a quick get request, http://1337, and this is going to /data, I believe. And then if we run this, it should just hang. However, we do actually see the word hello. So what just happened? Well, what happens is as follows. We made a get request to the /data, and then the first function that's kind of in the line of what we're telling this particular method to get, in other words, this particular endpoint to call, is we're telling it, go ahead and call the logger function. So it does that, right? And then every single function that you pass to an endpoint in Express receives the following arguments, rec, res, and next. So technically this here is really nothing more than a simple method handler, just the same as this is. But here's the crucial part. Considering because this function here is sitting in line before this function, the only way that our method handler here, the one that we've defined anonymously, could ever get called is if we use this crucial next argument right over here. So next really is just a function. So when you call next, it's a function. And what you're effectively telling Express is do whatever you need to do here. Once you're done, go ahead and call the next function that's in the chain. So if you can picture this as a chain, we've got the logger function here. That's like the first link in the chain. Then we've got the anonymous method handler right over here. That's kind of like the second link in the chain. In order for all of these to sort of work, every method handler, every piece of middleware must call on to the next one by calling the next function. So if I now rerun this code, we're going to see both the log and we're going to actually see our sample data coming back to Postman. And as you can see here, we now are no longer hanging. We actually see that we have a key of data whose value is hello. And if you open up the terminal, you'll see that we actually still have the log of hello. So that's all working. That's the basic concept of middleware. So that's what we're actually going to utilize now to actually check the token for every request. So with all that introduction of what middleware is out of the way, let's actually start implementing our own use case here. So we're going to be creating a function called check token right over here. And then check token is going to live right over here. So in other words, this is where we're defining it. This is where we're using it. Now, here's what check token is going to do. First things first, it's actually going to read the token out of headers. Now, the convention is to send authorization tokens like this in headers. The reason why the best place is to send it in via headers is because that would be a consistent transport between, say, GET requests and POST requests, right? Because a GET request doesn't have a body, a POST request does have a body. So if you might say that you want to send the token along in the POST request, that might work, or in the body, that might work for your POST request, but that will of course not work for your GET requests. But the headers is consistent across all different types of requests, which is why it would make it's a logical place to actually send the token along. So let's actually get that. So we're going to say rec.headers, and so we're going to be naming it. So we're assuming that the name of our header is going to be x access token. So that's going to be the name of the header that's going to hold our token. So we're going to actually go ahead and grab that from there. So now we're going to actually have this variable called token. So the first thing we need to do is to see if you even have a token, right? Because it's entirely possible you'll be making a request without ever having logged in and you don't even have a token. In which case, what we'll do is very simply just come right over here and we're just going to say res.status. We're immediately going to send back. Again, I can send back response directly from within my middleware because if you think about it, it's nothing more than just another method handler. There's nothing uniquely special about this, so I can directly respond back to the client directly from within my middleware function. I can just go ahead and say 401, and then I can say .json, and as before, we'll say that the message is access denied. Okay, so that handles what happens when you actually don't have a token. But what actually happens when you do have a token? Well, now we actually have to go ahead and verify that the token is a valid token. So the JSON Web Token library actually offers a method called JWT.verify. And basically it accepts 3 arguments. The first one is going to be the actual token that we're trying to verify. The second one is going to be the same secret that we used earlier. Now it's crucial that these secrets match up, because if they don't, well then JSON Web Token is going to say this token wasn't sent by me, it wasn't signed by me, therefore I can't verify it. In other words, the key will not match the door, right? So this is the same secret that we have up over here. And then finally it receives a callback function, and this callback function receives an error, and then it receives a decoded. Now decoded will basically represent the decoded version of our token. So first thing we have to do is handle the error clause. So we're going to say if we have an error, well then in this case we're just going to go ahead and say res.status of 401, and for whatever reason this can honestly be for multiple reasons, right? This can be because either the token had already expired, because as you can see here we've said that the token expires after 30 minutes, so it's entirely possible that this token is just no longer valid, it's already expired. Or it could be that somebody tried to get fancy with us and send in a token that was signed via a different secret. That would also trip up this error. So all we're simply going to do is say that the token is no longer valid. Or actually, again, we're going to keep the messages kind of vague. We're just going to say access denied, right? So that's going to be that use case. But if finally you do have a token and it doesn't trip up the error, meaning it is actually a valid token, well now we actually have a decoded version of the token. So if you remember, when we actually signed the token, we actually signed it by passing in the user ID right over here. So we're basically saying that the user ID is going to be equal to the actual user.id. So we actually signed this particular person who just logged in, we signed their ID into the token. And so now this is where we can actually get that token back out. So this is going to be very helpful for us. So we'll say rec.userid, right? So in other words, we have this rec object right over here, which represents the request object of Express, which is just a simple object in JavaScript, which you can just extend by attaching your own properties to it. So we're going to add our own property to it called userid, which is going to be equal, which will be equal to the decoded .userid right over here. Okay, so this is now starting to talk about the fact that when we came over here and we actually did log in, so the token was able to represent and tell us who we are, who was able to tell the server who is currently logged in and which data am I supposed to send back. Am I supposed to send back John's data, or am I supposed to send back Jane's data? And this is what's actually happening right over here. We're basically saying rec.userid, give me the user ID of the one that you just brought out of the decoded token. And then finally we go ahead and we call next. So now that we actually have this done, we come to the next function, which means that what's going to end up happening now is our individual method handler is going to get called. So we've come through the check token. We do in fact have a token. We have verified it. We've decoded it. Now come on and move on to the actual method handler. So once we're in the method handler, now what we can actually do is we can come back to our cars table, and we can actually go ahead and do a simple JavaScript filter to simply get all the cars that belong to this particular user, and that would look something like this. So we're going to go ahead and say const filtered is equal to cars.filter on a car, where car.userid is equal to rec.userid. So finally, once we've done that, we can come back right over here and we can say that the data will be equal to filtered. So if we did everything correctly, I kind of did all this without really testing the code as I went, because I just kind of got carried away explaining it. But if it all was done correctly, we should now be able to see that we have the same exact behavior as we did in the sample app that I demonstrated earlier. So if we come on over to data right now, if I do a simple send without doing anything, we get message access denied. Now let's go ahead and create a new request. This one will be a post request. Let's go ahead and hit send, and we do in fact get a token. That's great. So now we actually take this token and come back to this request right over here, go on over to the headers. And so what we're going to do is create a new header called X access token, because that's what we said we're going to be naming it. The value will be equal to the token that we've just received from the login. Go ahead and hit send, and we do in fact get our data. As you can see, we're getting all the data that belongs to the user ID of 1. So let's go ahead and log in as Jane, just to make sure that it all works. We'll say Jane, and then password 1. We're going to log in, get a new token. Now this is Jane's token. Come back over here, replace this token with Jane's, hit send, and now we get all of the cars that belong to the user ID of 2. Well, anyways, that does it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please do subscribe and give us a like, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.